Talk a little bit about the moment when this was made. I mean, one of the things that, while watching it, that brought me back was that this was really a moment before the phrase American independent cinema was spoken about and whatever. Talk a little bit about the scene and seeing names like Luke Sant and Nan Golden and Phil Klein and a lot of people up there really brought back an era.
Well, it was a fantastic period of filmmaking in New York because there were no rules, there were no unions, there were no for people making low-budget films like ourselves. And the streets were pretty much ours, so we could just go out and shoot what we wanted. We worked on each other's films. I produced Jim's Permanent Vacation and Stranger Than Paradise. And he shot my movies. He shot this movie, and he shot Sleepwalk, my first feature. We really had a kind of attitude which was, anybody can pick up a camera, anybody can pick up a guitar, just try to make it work. And if you make mistakes, then we learn from them. And and this film was actually sort of unusual in the whole scene of downtown New York because it was an adaptation of a story by Paul Bowles, who was an author whose books I couldn't really find in the late 70s. I had to go to an English bookstore in order to get his books before they were republished. And I was a huge fan of his writing. And I remember I read this story, and it was a 7-page story, and I was shocked by it. I was like totally stunned. And I was like, wow, what happened at the end? And I thought, I got to direct this movie exactly how I first read this story. So I tried to stay really true to the story. And then Phil Klein had been who's a wonderful composer, had been Jim's best friend since 4th grade, and he lived around the corner from us. Nan lived down the street. We all lived very near each other. And Nan and Suzanne Fletcher, the lead actress in the film, they had run away from home together when they were 16. And all these people who were coloring outside the lines all sort of ended up in lower Manhattan. And there were a lot of different art forms of people who were all congregating and meeting, and we were all germinating each other at that time. It was a very exciting time to be young and an artist in New York.
How did Paul Bowles get the film?
Well, I read the story, and then I went ahead, as we all had that very attitude that we were, unstoppable. I went ahead and made the film without the rights. And then I wrote to Paul Bowles because William Burroughs used to live around the corner from us, and I got his address through William Burroughs. My friend Howard Bruckner was making a documentary about Burroughs at the time. And so I wrote to Paul, and I said, I made this film, who should I go to? How can I get the rights to it? And he said, oh, you have to see my agent, Ned Levitt, at William Morris. And I went, oh, no. And I didn't have any money. I didn't know what to do. So I went up to see Ned. I showed him the film. He said, it's a good thing you made the film first, because I wouldn't have given you the rights if you hadn't, and I love the film. So we'll give you all the rights. And then Paul and I started to have this exchange, this letter exchange, which was so fantastic. And then when this whole thing happened with finding the print, it made me revisit those letters from Paul. And he was so generous to a 24-year-old filmmaker who out of the blue contacted him, and so eloquent and so supportive. And so I sent him the print because you didn't have VHS then. You had no other way he could see the film. And I was very curious to know what he would think, and I wanted to thank him for the rights. So I sent the film to him, and until Francis's phone call, I had forgotten that I had this young man named Guy Zimmerman, who was also in our circle, who's a playwright. He told me that his parents were friends with Paul and Jane, and he was going to Tangier. This was in '82. And I said, can you please carry this print to Paul Bowles? So he carried the print to Paul Bowles and projected it for Paul. And he said he's going to write up his story at some point, because I'm so curious, since he was in the room with Paul while Paul was watching it, because Paul wrote me his critique of the film, but I wonder what really happened, right, being in the room with him after he saw the film, what he felt. And it was interesting because Francis and I we're traveling, and there's some other people, Regina, who we were traveling this past year because it was the 100th birthday of Paul Bowles. And the film was shown to a lot of Bowles scholars. And I thought, oh my gosh, this could be the hardest crowd. And they were very embracing of the film. The people who knew Paul, had worked with Paul, had studied Paul's writings. And one of the interesting things that came out was they said this story reminds them more of a Jane story than a Paul story, because it's an unusual story for Paul. And I hadn't realized that until meeting all these wonderful people who are connected with Paul Bowles, Paul and Jane.